In today's journey, we return to the Merlot after 15 days of fermenting, as it is now time to move on to stabilization and clarification. Confident Phil is starting the day off by forgetting to take a hydrometer reading. We'll let him go and see how much else he forgets, as none of this is going to harm the wine in the long run, and shows as a good example of why you should always read the instructions even if you've done the wine kit before, as sometimes they even update the recipes themselves. It looks like Phil's going to start with the transfer. The instructions say to lift at least 3 feet, but what you really need is just for it to be higher than the vessel you're moving it into. Someday we're going to upgrade the lab jack to have a drill motor attached to it, but until then, Phil will have to do it by hand. And now that we're at the desired height, we will use a mini auto siphon to transfer from the higher jug into the smaller jug. A sanitized jug, of course. To get best results with any auto siphon, it is best to use one solid stroke to go up, wait a moment for the center chamber to fill, and then push down firmly. If flow does not start immediately, do another quick pump until it does. For your convenience, we will be fast forwarding through this transfer. It took about 4 minutes of real time to complete this transfer. You will hear a lot of opinions on the best way to perform a siphon, but Phil likes to put it all the way to the bottom towards the beginning to make sure that he gets as much liquid as possible to transfer over, as he is less worried about transferring over a small amount of lees as much as he is about losing any of the wine. It can be a little nerve-wracking as we reach the bottom, as if any air comes in through the sides, it can inhibit the siphon suction, which could be near impossible to restart a siphon at this point, which is why Phil is tipping the jug on its side to get every last drop to transfer over. We will fast forward through the last few moments. Once you hear that gurgle, you know the transfer is complete. And with that, we're done with the first jug and auto siphon. And here we can see Phil getting a little ahead of himself, forgetting about the rest of the stuff he's supposed to do today. We'll see how long it takes. If your guess was several hours, you got it right. But don't worry, Phil's come back. And with a little TV magic, you wouldn't have noticed without me telling you. Well, other than he put the wrong top on. So we'll pretend like it was noon that never happened, and move on to taking a hydrometer reading. With these small amounts, it can be kind of tricky, so sometimes you just have to find the best way possible for you. We use our small beakers to take small samples, though a baster would probably work best. The thief also kind of works, but due to these smaller volumes, it can take 3 to 4 different pulls to fill the test jar all the way. Whereas it only takes 2 pulls with our 100mm beakers to fill the test jar enough. We pre-sanitize the test jar and the hydrometer so that we can pour it back in later. In fact, you can almost safely always assume that we over-sanitize everything that comes in contact with anything in our studio. Obnoxiously so. So once you make sure that your table is level, give the hydrometer a spin as you drop it in, and make sure it's not leaning up against the wall before taking a proper reading, as seen here. Your hydrometer reading should be 0996 or lower before continuing. If it is higher, return it to the fermentation station for a couple of days and then recheck. If you're having troubles, leave a comment down below. We now start the stabilization process by taking the potassium metabisulfite and the potassium sorbate and mixing them into 1/8 cup or 2 tablespoons of clean water. And here we see Phil being far more careful to be sure that he gets every bit of the chemicals in compared to last time. As with these smaller batches, the margin of error is much smaller when compared to a 6-gallon recipe. And these stabilizers are extremely important as they will not only kill and inhibit the yeast that is currently in there, but also stabilize the wine for more long-term storage. But if you do plan for this wine to be aged longer than 6 months, you may need to add more to preserve flavor and color. Mix this mixture thoroughly. A great benefit for making your own wine at home is that you can control how much sulfites go into your wine. But when compared to most store-bought wines, this recipe already contains far less. We now take the thoroughly mixed mixture and add it into the wine, that we will now need to mix, either by hand, with the spoon that Phil fumbles all over the place, but he chooses not to, and in classic fashion, uses an overpowered tool. A mix stir can be great for mixing a 6-gallon recipe, but can be a little overpowered when using it on a 1-gallon recipe, as you can see in a moment. We will now fast forward for your convenience until he's done playing around. Although not all fun and games, as the degassing process is extremely important if you want to get high quality wine and get the total clarification to happen later. Once Phil sees that less bubbles are forming after 2 minutes of stirring with the mixture, it's time to move on from stabilization to clarification. Once he's done putting down that stupid drill. The additive up next is the Kytostan, with a shout out to Larry for telling us how to pronounce that correctly. As everyone can always learn something in this industry. Once the package is open, we now just add directly in and start mixing again, which we will fast forward through, as it took far longer than it should have for no reason whatsoever. Although don't let that discourage you from taking your time, as again, the degassing process is extremely important. Which is why in the industry they use vacuum pumps to do this instead of doing it by hand, to be sure that every last bit of CO2 is removed from solution. And now with Phil done making a mess, it's time to move on to the last step. Letting the lid drain completely before putting a solid stopper on. This is important as we do not want any liquids being sucked in through the airlock if a vacuum forms during clarification. We now return this to its fermentation station at about 72 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit for 14 days. Do not worry about any gunk or crud forming on the sides or tops of the wine, as this is the clarification process happening before your eyes. The astute may have noticed that Phil never actually poured the hydrometer sample back in. That's because he has another plan for it. It may taste a little hot in the alcohol, but it is a good idea to take a taste from time to time to see how much your wine changes during the fermentation process.